Welcome back. Well, yes, indeed, focusing on the economy. What do we expect? How are they going to play themselves out? Two gentlemen joining us next on the program. Mr. Ben Akabueze is the DG Budget Office, as well as Dr. Chimike Oba, a development economist. Gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Mr. Akabueze, let me start with you. In terms of expectations of Nigerians, it is huge. So if you could, we know that the president did speak about what they intend to do to revamp the economy and ensure that the national economic diversification agenda is on track. So could you tell us, how is this budget connecting to that, raising expectations for Nigerians?
Well, thank you, Chamberlain, and Happy New Year once again.
Thank you.
Basically, the budget, as you know, is simply a tool. The budget is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. And underlying every budget, is certain objectives and goals and principles that the government of the day is pursuing. A budget is, as much an economic tool as a political one that seeks to basically deliver on the proverbial dividends of, democracy. So when you look at this budget of 13.6 trillion naira approximately, an aggregate of 4.1 trillion naira, which equates to 30.1% has been allocated to capital expenditure. This is consistent with the policy, adopted by the current administration to try and allocate up to 30% of the budget to capital expenditure, and especially focused on the infrastructure sector. We face critical infrastructure, challenges, and it's really, it's imperative that we fix that for the economy to grow. Ultimately, the budget must deliver growth, because without growth, everything else that we're talking about really, doesn't, will not fall into place. But let me say this up front, that the federal government's budget, it's only one source of public spending in Nigeria. As you know, we operate a federal system. So we've got the federal government's budget, we've got the budgets of the 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory. And by the way, each of the 774 local governments is required.
We'll let you shed more light on that important part as well. Just hang on a minute. We'll let you shed light on that important part as well. But let's also quickly get Dr. Oba's brief opening before we go to break. Dr. Oba, do you see this achieving the required growth for the economy, the budget?
First, it's important to make a quick distinction between growth and development, as it were. Whereas the budget may crystallize into a minimal growth or relative growth in terms of GDP and all that. But what's the essence of growth when it doesn't reflect in the standard of living of people who are resident in Nigeria? So for me, I'm more interested in how would this budget, better the loss of millions of Nigerians that are already trapped in poverty, extreme poverty level. And in answering that question, I would say in clear terms that I do not see the budget as currently proposed addressing those critical issues, more so when we have witnessed over time that, yes, whereas the capital budget is about 30.0%, 30.1% of the entire budget. The big question should be, how much of such money is actually expended on key infrastructural or social sectors that will now give rise into key improvements in development in the country.
All right, Dr. Oba. So, gentlemen, just hold your positions. We'll be back in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Mr. Akabueze, it appeared as though you were trying to highlight how the combined effect of the federal and state budgets can have an impact on the economy and perhaps provide the requisite growth. Is that the point you're trying to make? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chamberlain. I was, trying to, avert our minds to the fact that the budget, the national budget, does not equate to the federal government's budget. But, it seems like Nigerians generally have basically all the analysis is focused on the federal government's budget. When people talk about how much we are spending on education, they're talking about how much the federal government is spending, is allocating. Whereas education is a matter on the concurrent legislative list, so is health. Those really key issues called issues of development that speak to the people are really, based on our constitutional arrangement, more in the terrain of the subnational governments. But people really, some people really don't look in that direction and they expect the federal government's budget to solve every problem. So every community in the country is looking to see some provision for it in the federal government's budget. And it really can't be, that way. Having said that also, the reality is that when you combine the budgets of the federal, the state, and the local governments, in aggregate public spending in Nigeria is way below the threshold where it should be. Aggregate public spending, as a percentage of our GDP, is about 50% of the African average. And why is that so? It's so because our revenue generation, public, sector revenues, government revenues in Nigeria is 1/3 of the, it's also a half of the African, average. Our tax to GDP ratio is among the lowest is about the lowest in the whole world. I'm not even talking about Africa. So our budget, not just of the federal, but of the subnational governments, our budgets are way too small to be able to address our needs in the way that people expect. Unfortunately, in the last 5 years, we've found ourselves first in the recession 2016, and then just as we were turning the curve, the COVID-19 induced recession. And during a recession, it's difficult to grow revenues because during a recession, you've got to act in a counter-cyclical manner. And so government's drive for revenues have been constrained. When we came up with Economic Recovery and Growth Plan in 2017, the 2017 to 2020 plan, the plan was to move government revenue as a percentage of GDP from our base of 6% back in 2014 to 15% by 2020, which will be 1% below the African average. But here we are in 2020 at just above 8%.
Yes. If you don't mind me butting in for just one moment, something that you said earlier, and which, of course, you have repeated a good number of times in previous conversations, that we have a very, very low budget culture, because what we have, as you have often said, is a fraction of what we should be spending, to get us to where we want to get to. But the challenge here is what I would like you to point to, because if we look at the budget that we have now, we are spending a good amount of money, a significant, something in the region of 1/3 or thereabout, on debt servicing. What we are spending on capital infrastructure, I would like you to also speak to that, because perhaps if we had a better infrastructure instead of a capital, so much easier for people to go into business, because it is only when people do good business and they're able to make good money that they can pay more tax and more revenue into the coffers of government. So do you want to speak to what the challenges are as to why we are unable to generate the kind of revenue that we need to generate as a nation, especially in the light of the debt servicing burden and the very low capital budget that we always have?
Well, I think that this goes back in time to history. Pre-independence and in the First Republic, taxation represented the principal source of government revenues, and that's how budgets were funded. And that's how countries all over the world fund their budgets. Unfortunately, when we became an oil-rich economy, in the early 70s, we basically dropped the ball on taxation and focused on resource-based rent as a means for funding government. Basically, what we call the social contract that forms the basis of modern governance was vitiated, and the social contract says that the sovereign has authority to tax the people, but in exchange, it also delivers goods, public goods and services. But we basically, taxpayers' money just became a cliche. Most Nigerians were not paying taxes. And over time, the culture of not paying taxes has taken root. And it's extremely difficult to recreate that culture. And so now it's become a chicken and egg situation, because unfortunately, not only did we drop the ball on focusing on taxation, as we focus on the resource-based rent, the quality of public spending through the decades was admittedly poor. And so now you've got a situation where, to get people to pay taxes, they're saying, no, give me good, deliver goods and services first before I can pay taxes. And it becomes a chicken and egg situation. But the point is, if we're going to make progress, we've got to reestablish that, social contract that forms the basis for modern governance.
Okay.
The people must pay taxes and the people must hold government to account. We demonstrated that in Lagos State, that is doable. You increase the taxes and hold yourself accountable, more accountable to the people for what you do with the taxes. And this needs to happen on a national basis.
There are a number of other issues to raise on that, but let me take Mr. Chikuze's comment on that one. How do you see the response of Mr. Akabueze?
Yeah, first, I agree with him that the subnational budget needs to be part of the overall national budget. Unfortunately, we Nigerians pay little or no attention to what is happening at the subnational level. So it's also the same pilferage, wastages, and all that happens there. And that is why we're having also the kind of governance outcomes that we've got. But beyond that, with respect to the infrastructure issues and tax, let me go to tax issue. Dr. Akabueze spoke about social contract chicken and eggs issue. Yes, Nigerians are supposed to pay tax, but the key question is that even now that we aren't paying tax, that we are depending more on oil revenue, oil rents, what is the government or the governments at all the levels are doing with the resources that are available to them? If you look at our national budget and subnational budgets annually, it does appear that the security votes and expenses made on the governor's office and all those things, buying of cars, in fact, on frivolities, are so much that the citizens have lost confidence in the ability of the government to utilize the funds available to them to improve their lot. So if you've lost that confidence in your government, it becomes increasingly difficult for people to also pay tax. Secondly, if you do a proper analysis of responsiveness to tax payments in this country, you find out that it's even the poor people, the civil servants that are paying tax. Yes, the informal sector is huge, so there's a lot of tax avoidance and evasion. But you find out that the critical mass of the elites, those in government and those who are doing big businesses are not paying tax. They evade tax, they avoid tax, and which is why some of us are preaching that let's have, yes, you can reduce personal income tax a bit to encourage people to pass, but VAT, we should have a graduated of phased VAT rates, so that some of them that consume very luxury goods can pay VAT, because that's the only way you can get them to pay this money. When you do a phased VAT rates, where you have little tax for those critical basic goods for poor people, they pay very little. But for those that consume champagne and all those big things, you can raise your VAT up to 25-30%. And because they're interested in spending money on those things, they will pay tax. We also need to increase our tax nets instead of increasing tax rates as it were. But most importantly, to get people to respond very well on tax payments, the government must show commitment also that they are with the people. You know, recently I said it's about sacrifices. If you check the cost of governance, you see people buying Jeeps, SUVs every year. You see how much that is being spent at state houses, both at the federal and district. When a governor wants to move, he goes with a convoy of about 20 cars that he used fuel, and most of these cars are started and they steam for at least 10 to 15 minutes before the governor enters. These are wastages. And we, the citizens, are seeing some of these things. And when you ask them to pay tax, you don't expect them to pay those tax. Now, in terms of expenditure, I was speaking earlier on in terms of capital expenditure. You know, when we say budget performance, we say, like the president said, he said budget performance was about 97%. And I laughed. I am one of those in the school of thought that spending is different from budget performance. That you spent 100 naira does not mean that you have actually performed 100%. You may have spent 100,000 on wastages, when in actual sense the benefits that would have accrued from such expenditure is about 1%. So we measure performance based on benefits, based on outcome, based on impact, and not based on actual spending. So most times we do a budget and we spend these funds without a commensurate benefit to those who are supposed to utilize such things.
Well, Dr. Oba, thank you. Let me ask Dr. Akabueze some of the issues that you have raised. Dr. Akabueze, he's talked about one very, very critical thing in terms of the revenue, which is tax net versus tax raise. How do you respond to that one?
Well, you know, first of all, again, based on our constitutional arrangement, taxation of individuals, personal income tax, is in the forte of the state governments. It's based on a national legislation, the personal income tax, but then the administration and the benefits of it derive, basically go to the state governments. It's only taxes of people like members of the armed forces and like that goes to the federal government. And so personal income tax is in the forte of the states. And so individuals who pay taxes is really the state governments. They should be holding to account for their taxes. The corporate taxes go to the federal government. Okay. So that's
an issue. Just a quick one on that. He raised an issue on the fact that we have a very broad SME sector that many of them are not already in the tax net. What's the plan? If you agree with him, what's the plan to bring them into the tax net? Maybe perhaps with some incentives?
Yes. First of all, there is what we call the Joint Tax Board, which basically is a forum for, the Inland Revenue Service, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, and all the internal revenue services of the states and the Federal Capital Territory. this joint tax board is a platform for them to work collaboratively to try and grow the tax, expand the tax base. And between 2015 and now, nationally, we've grown that by about 20 million people, adding about 20 million people to the tax base nationally. It's tough work trying to get, especially people in the informal sector, especially in a country where you do not have a unique identifier. These are all the things that having this national ID number will also help. There's now a nationally, a unified, tax identification number system, which, over the last, few years, the Joint Tax Board has, implemented. And so now, that is being driven. That's why for you to have a bank account now, you need a TIN. For you to do business with any of the governments, they require you to provide a TIN. These are all part of the framework for establishing a tax payment culture, which we haven't had in place, over the past decades, and which therefore make it difficult to basically, focus on taxation.
Yeah, one other thing that he raised. My apologies. Yes. One other thing that he raised is to draw a difference between budget spending and budget performance. Perhaps that is also why people are reluctant to pay taxes, because they haven't seen the effect of whatever public spending on their lives. So you want to, respond to that part of the budget spending performing better than budget performance on the lives of the people?
Well, first of all, when it comes to budget performance, usually, we adopt, there's a framework called the input, output, outcome, framework. The input is what you put in, which is the resources that you put in. The output is a tangible physical measure of what that gets you. And then the outcome is the impact that, that it actually delivers. And, it's easy for us to measure input, output. But again, what happens all over the world is that civil society organizations and interested people like Dr. Oba hold the feet of government to the fire when it comes to outcome. So it's not sufficient to throw it out as a general statement, but it's to say, basically, with examples and say, look, in this particular area, you've spent this much, but we don't think that, value has been delivered, because government has its own internal mechanisms for measuring, value that is being delivered. There's a budget monitoring and evaluation, department, even in the budget office of the Federation. There's also a national monitoring and evaluation, department. There's a requirement of the law, the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007, for us to issue a quarterly budget implementation report, which goes to the National Assembly, goes to the Fiscal Responsibility Commission, and other, which basically is saying this, and the Auditor General office also looks into this thing. So from the standpoint of government, where they think there hasn't been value, that's what gets called out, even in the Auditor General's report and other such reports that you see in the public domain. So, but if there's a sense the public that's not, the public needs to do its own independent assessment and call government out. That's how it happens, in other climes.
So, Dr. Oba, have you or would you be perhaps interfacing with some of those agencies or taking those measures to enhance perspectives on this subject matter which you just raised about budget performance?
Yeah, I think that's one of the decisions I took this January. But in specific times, Dr. Akabueze just asked if I can mention few. During COVID-19, the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, distributed money, shared money. Let me use that word, shared money. And before that happened, the argument was that how would you determine the poorest of the poor? You know, they brought up this issue of how much money you have in your bank account, the credit you recharge and all that. But one thing struck me when they said that the list that will be adopted is the list they've been using in the last 5 years for conditional cash transfer. Now, the big question I asked to myself and I threw in the air was, number one, if you've been giving people money in the last 5 years and their standard of living has not improved, the big question will be, what initially was the objective for such venture? Because the truth is that if such money is given to reduce poverty, then we should be able to see poverty reducing in Nigeria and not increasing. And when you check the budget that has been made for the same ministry in 2021 budget, social reinvestment and all that, you see that it is very huge. So the key question is that what do we intend to achieve with this thing? You can't give people money when you've not trained them on how to manage funds, on entrepreneurship and all those things. So what it means that is dash money that goes into feeding, just feeding without creating wealth. And for me, that is not sustainable. That is one aspect. The other aspect is insecurity. You know, most times when budgets are meant for security, you know, security architecture here now, I'm looking at the defense budget, the police budget, the army budget and all that. It's usually very huge. But the question is also that we have seen insecurity, you know, increasing in the country over these years. I'm not just saying this administration, but over the years. Now, if I'm the person of, sorry, the big question I'll ask is that, what is the proximate cost, or actual cost of rising insecurity in Nigeria, in the country? So it becomes important to identify the key costs. It's like treating headache when the cause of headache is cancer. Until you treat cancer, the headache will continue reoccurring. So it's important that we understand that unemployment, poverty issues, and health issues, health security issues are part of the underpinning driving force for the rising insecurity in Nigeria. So it becomes important to begin to deal with those key issues underpinning insecurity, other than increasing security budget. So when you see that we're increasing security budget, we can say we have budgeted 1 trillion naira and we spend 1 trillion and we say performance 100%. But when you check the actual performance in terms of the objectives for expenditure, you find out that we are less than 20%. So these are key, some of the key examples I'll give. But like I said, part of the decisions I took in 2021 is to get more involved in monitoring and evaluation of public expenditure across national and subnational.
Gentlemen, we're winding down now. If you could keep your responses short, we'll appreciate it. But Mr. Akabueze, in addition to whichever response you like to give to what he just said, could you also speak to, what is the thinking, and this has to do with the revenue challenges we have, because at the moment, sale of national assets, we don't know how long we can continue. But is there any thinking, or what is the thinking concerning states, rather than going cap in hand to the center, do a lot more with the resources they have within their states, such that they can generate a lot more within those states?
Well, if I start with that, you know, truth is, constitutionally, the federal government, you know, is limited in terms of its policy options. And so we try and use persuasion, we try and use carrot and stick approach. So for instance, there's a World Bank funded program called the SIFTAS program. Recently you heard about the World Bank approving $1.5 billion. You know, it was essentially towards that, you know, going, you know, to the states. It's not the federal government. But because the World Bank only lent to the national government, which then on-lends to the states. And it's under a program. This, you know, it's a state fiscal transparency and accountability, where in exchange for basically improving their systems of fiscal accountability, which includes getting their budget out in time, publishing reports, fiscal reports, doing all of that, putting in place audits and all of that, you know, the states that demonstrate progress in that get access to these resources from the World Bank. It's through those kinds of incentives that the federal government, but otherwise it rests with the state legislatures, it rests with the citizens of those states to drive accountability at the level of the states. But let me speak to,
if you could make it short so we can wind down, please.
About impact on poverty or whatever. But, oftentimes a lot is made about the money allocated to this social investment program. And, when you look at it, it looks so large, but when you unpack it, so let me take two key components of that. If you take the N-Power program, recently, there were 500,000 young Nigerians, employed under that. They get 30,000 naira allowance every month. That amounts to 15 billion naira every month. To pay, each of them is 30,000, but that's 500,000 people. That's 15 billion. On the cash, conditional cash transfer register, and yes, that is dash money, and globally that has been established to help lift some people. There are some people who get a dash money of 5,000 naira a month. The national register for that is now over 3-point-something million people. That's what the president said.
Okay, because I think some of the concerns was the yardstick for some of those, which they also question.
If you take only 2 million of people who get 5,000 naira a month, if you give 5,000 naira a month to 2 million people, that's 10 billion naira. So these monies add up very easily, whereas at that level, 5,000 naira isn't going to lift somebody out of poverty. But the poverty problem will have been worse without it.
Okay, I want to anchor that point. Pardon me, Dr. Chinuke Uba, development economist, and Mr. Ben Akabueze, DG Budget Office. Gentlemen, thank you both for talking to us today on the program.
Thank you.
Well, the issues are not just going to go away. We just have to continue to pound on
It's
them.
economy.
Yes. Comrade Edwin's tweet is the first of your contribution today on the program. It talks about the service chiefs. The first lockdown and ASU strike were indirectly related to NSARS. Nigeria can't afford a second lockdown. It's demoralizing and demotivating for young officers to be retiring while their chiefs are still working. Allow the service chiefs to retire for sanity to return.
Well, Mr. Pali, talking about APC and governance, says, I believe APC came in to correct the wrongs, not to keep blaming after 6 years and take us back. All we hear from FG is, we have seen and we will do. When do we get to hear that we have done and this is the result?
Great question. Folari says, thanks for using your platform to enlighten more Nigerians who had hoaxed up the COVID-19 here in Akwa Ibom, particularly as I have been observing since I came. Careless approach abounds here, especially wearing of masks.
Well, Irabo Josephs, your email says, the ABC members are not telling the president the truth of state of affairs in Nigeria. How can one explain that the service chiefs have been on set for 6 years? APC has an agenda which they are hiding from Nigerians, he says. Well, there you go. Thank you all for your comments. Hey, always nice to hear from you. We'll see you again tomorrow. I'm Chamberlain Uso.
And I'm Ayo Makide. Have a wonderful day and please be safe.